Mr. Speaker.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our meeting today, of course, being Wednesday, November 2nd, 2016. We're, of course, embarking on a new study, and we have some witnesses. However, I'm going to turn to Mr. Doherty. I think you want to take the floor first.
Mr. Chair, pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, the Standing Committee of Fisheries and Oceans amend the end date. I'd like to put forward the following motion. Amend the end date of the Study on Fisheries Act review to include at least 4 additional meetings to ensure that affected stakeholders in every region of the country are provided with an opportunity to appear, and to guarantee that the committee can properly incorporate and respond to the feedback received from public consultations by the Government of Canada and the committees at the committee's earliest convenience. And with your approval, Mr. Chair, I'd like to put that forth.
Yes, indeed. The motion's in order, and I'd like to open the floor to debate on Mr. Doherty's motion. Mr. MacDonald.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And of course, as everybody is well aware, I made the original motion, and we selected that date at the time. It was voted on by committee and passed. I believe at the time it was probably passed unanimously for February 28, and I would suggest we leave it at that date. And barring saying very little more on it, I now move a motion to adjourn debate.
As we now know, of course, there's a motion that we have to get to right away, just to check for clarification. And a motion to adjourn debate has been put forward. Therefore, the vote must happen. All those, one moment. Vote to adjourn the debate. All those in favor of adjourning the debate. Need to see some hands. All those opposed. 5-4. Seeing in favor of adjourned debate, the debate is now adjourned. We'll move on. Okay. That being said, we want to welcome the Minister here today. This starts out. This is our study that we approved some time ago, as Mr. MacDonald mentioned. So I'm going to read out, pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, and the motion adopted by the committee on September 19, 2016, that the committee, in light of the letter provided by the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard and the Minister of Transport, review and study the scope of application of the Fisheries Act, and specifically the serious harm of fish prohibition, how the prohibition is implemented to protect fish and fish habitat, the capacity of Fisheries and Oceans Canada to deliver on fish and fish habitat protection through project review, monitoring and enforcement, the definition of serious harm to fish and commercial, recreational and aboriginal fisheries, the use of regulatory authorities under the Fisheries Act and other related provisions of the Act, and provide its recommendations in a report to the House no later than Tuesday, February 28, 2017. Today appearing before us we have from the Department of Fisheries, Oceans and Canadian Coast Guard, we have the Minister himself, the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc. We also have his Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Serge Cormier, also Catherine Blewett with the Department, as well as Kevin Stringer and Philip Morrill. Now I understand, Minister LeBlanc, you will have 10 minutes. And Mr. Cormier, you too will have 20 minutes. Oh, 10 minutes, sorry. That's only because we like you.
Are you suggesting 20 minutes each, Mr. Chair? Would that be, would you?
No, 10 minutes is fine. 10 minutes is fine. Thank you. My apologies. Thank you. So go ahead, Minister LeBlanc. You have the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to our colleagues in the House of Commons. Thank you for your invitation. C'est un moment spécial pour moi.
It's a special moment for me. It's the first time that I appear as Minister of Fisheries, Ocean and the Canadian Coast Guard. It's the first time I have an opportunity to appear before your committee, so I hope this won't be the last time. But this is the first time today, and I'm delighted. As you said, Mr. Chair.
Senior officials of our department, Catherine Blewett, who's our Deputy Minister, is a new Deputy Minister in Ottawa, had been the Clerk of the Executive Council, most senior public servant in the province of Nova Scotia, and joined the senior ranks of the public service in June. It's certainly Nova Scotia's loss and our gain that she's joined us in the department. And Mr. Chairman, you introduced Kevin Stringer, the Associate Deputy Minister, and Philippe Morel, who is the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Fisheries Management and Ecosystems. And obviously on my right, all of you know my colleague from New Brunswick and our Parliamentary Secretary, Serge Cormier, who will, as you said, Mr. Chair, have a few brief comments after mine. So, Mr. Chairman, comme j'ai dit,
as I said, this is my first appearance before your committee, and I must say that I am very enthusiastic and pleased that the Prime Minister has asked me to be Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Coast Guard. As you know, Mr. Chair, our oceans are facing numerous stressors such as overfishing, habitat loss and destruction, marine pollution, and warming sea temperatures, all of which are having a negative impact on our oceans and ecosystems.
Our commercial, recreational, and indigenous fisheries for future generations. One of the most sensible places to start is to protect fish habitat, because quite simply put, without fish habitat, there will be ultimately no fisheries. Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, in my view, amendments made to the Fisheries Act in 2012 and 2013 stripped out and weakened some of the environmental protections that were specific to fish habitat. Most startlingly, Mr. Chair, the fisheries protection provisions that are currently in the Act don't even reference fish habitat. I've also heard that there is some increasing uncertainty as to which bodies of water and fish species are currently in fact protected under the Act. My concern is that many of these changes were made without consulting the people who were most impacted by these changes. Indigenous and environmental groups were especially concerned that changes made to the Act and perceived these amendments as a weakening of what should be a shared goal of protecting fish and fish habitat. Industry partners also became uncertain with regard to the regulatory requirements for which ultimately they would be responsible. Notre gouvernement a entendu ces
Our government heard these concerns, and we promised to take action. In my mandate letter from the Prime Minister, I was asked to review the previous government's changes to the Fisheries Act and look at ways we can restore lost protections and incorporate modern safeguards. But we did not want to do it by ourselves without consulting those that are potentially impacted by these changes.
A holistic approach to reviewing fishery protection provisions contained within the Act. And with that in mind, I am very happy, and I know my colleagues in the department are, with your committee's decision to consult with Canadians on how to better protect fish and fish habitat, and in so doing to ensure the long-term sustainability of Canada's fisheries. Mr. Chair, we recognize the importance of putting in place processes to ensure a robust dialogue with provinces, territories, and obviously Indigenous people. À cette fin, nous travaillons au sein d'un groupe de travail.
To that end, we are working through a special task group reporting to the Canadian Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture ministers to discuss this issue. We have also set up a number of bilateral meetings between our DFO regional staff and provincial and territorial colleagues responsible for fisheries, environment, and natural resource issues to discuss provincial, territorial perspectives. And as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous people have expressed serious concerns with the amendments made to this piece of legislation 5 or 6 years ago. So to help encourage participation and to benefit from their traditional ecological knowledge, my department is holding face-to-face meetings with various Indigenous groups and providing funding so that they can attend these meetings and share their views on this matter.
Welcome the opinions of all Canadians and encourage everyone to be part of this important conversation. To facilitate that, the department has launched an online public consultation. I'm sure many of you have already seen the site. It's called letstalkfishhabitat.ca. Here, people can share their ideas about what protections are needed to ensure fish have a healthy environment in which to live, feed and reproduce, as well as healthy corridors to migrate between such places. Should your committee find it helpful, Mr. Chair, we would obviously be very happy to share with all of you the feedback we receive through these various departmental consultations at a time that you would find appropriate. As Minister, Mr. Chair, and considering the amendments to the Fisheries Act are some of the most important responsibilities for somebody in my job, I thought before these decisions are made, we would ask Canadians to consider the following issues. What concerns do people have around the Fisheries Act changes and why? Where can we make improvements? How can we incorporate the latest science and traditional Indigenous knowledge into this work? Will the amendments take into consideration future realities such as the impacts of climate change? And will additional enforcement measures and resources be required on the part of our department? And are the current penalties considered successful as the appropriate deterrence mechanism? So, Mr. Chair, I look forward to the work your committee will do, to the recommendations that you will formulate, to the evidence you will hear from Canadians and interested people. I think all of us benefit from having a very open and frank conversation about ways that we can improve this important environmental and economic legislation. And that's why I wanted to thank all of you, and I know my colleagues from the department share that view. Thank all of you for having undertaken this work and tell you that we are entirely at your disposition should you or your colleagues require any information, any briefings, any support. And we're in your hands, Mr. Chair, as to how and when you'd like to receive regular updates on these ongoing consultations that we're doing, either with the public or some of these more directed consultations with provincial governments and other groups, for example, Indigenous groups. So with that, Mr. Chair, I look forward to your questions, but I know all of you look forward very much to hearing Serge Cormier's presentation. And with that and your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I conclude my remarks.
Yes, indeed.
Point of order, Mr.
Point
Chair.
of order.
Mr. Chair, the Honourable Minister himself has said that this is the first time that he has appeared before this committee. With all due respect to the Parliamentary Secretary, I'm sure he's quite capable of reading his talking points and speaking. We are here to hear from the Minister. We don't get many opportunities to have this, the Minister appear before here by his own admission. I would prefer that the Minister takes the full 20 minutes.
Well, Mr. Doherty, our witnesses are in control of their own time. If they choose to split it with someone else, they certainly can. That always has been the practice. I agree that we don't often hear from parliamentary secretaries, but I'm afraid it still is their time.
I think it's important that Canadians, given the scope and the magnitude of this,
I realize
study,
that.
it's important to hear from the Minister of Fisheries himself.
I realize that, but you also have several minutes in questions and comments, so you can also go to the Minister directly if you wish to do so at that point, to use your discretion. However, at this point, I'm going to have to turn to Mr. Cormier, as Minister LeBlanc is sharing his time with him. Monsieur Cormier, for 10 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I think I'd like to take a few moments to thank you for the work you do as Chair, and I'd like to thank all the committee members for the excellent work that you do on this committee. I love working with you, so it's a real pleasure for me to be here. Mr. Chair, as a maritimer and son of a fisherman, I have strong ties to the ocean. I know from first-hand experience just how important our fisheries are from an economic, social, and cultural perspective. Today's appearance gives us an opportunity to talk about how our government is honouring the commitment we made to Canadians to review changes made to the Fisheries Act.
Canada's oldest pieces of federal legislation. Dating back to the Confederation, it gained royal assent in 1868 and became an essential tool in the government's ability to sustainably manage our fisheries and protect the habitat that support them. Over the years, the Act has been amended many times in order to keep up with modern realities. However, the most recent changes made in 2012-2013 generated some serious questions about whether Canada is doing all it can to protect one of our more precious resources. Cela réaffirme l'importance de la
This shows the importance of your committee's decision to help determine if any of the fish and fish habitat protections that were lost during the latest amendment should be restored. We will also take this opportunity to explore legislative ways we can incorporate new and modern safeguards that will further strengthen fish and fish habitat protections. So what are people telling us? More than 5,000 Canadians have already visited the website. We see that there's a high level of participation through online consultations and with respect to the measures on the online forum. What are people telling us? As we mentioned, more and more people are very concerned about the fish habitat and the cumulative effects on the habitat. There was a suggestion to create better habitat protection for certain species of fish, but we should also emphasize the measures that are required to protect fish habitat and that of various freshwater fishes. The person who drew this to our attention proposed that the minister establish a partnership with provincial governments in order to rectify these problems.
Also prompted a number of ideas and comments such as delegating of monitoring and enforcement to Indigenous Guardian, requiring greater catch data on all fish landings, including recreational, commercial, treaty, and more, and the needs to hire more fisheries officers. And not unexpected, Canadians are asking us to take a closer look at management practices and improve them, provide more data and information, and ensure it is available in a user-friendly format. One such idea called for an app that will help individuals and companies help locate their project in areas that will have a lower impact on fish and habitat right from the start. This app will gather specific habitat information from provinces, municipality, conservation groups, university, the federal government, and industry, and will be combined into a national online, publicly accessible fish habitat map. Others have merely highlighted the importance of, where feasible, the need to modernize the government fish continuing tool in order to improve the efficiency of fish population survey. Une fois la période de consultation en ligne terminée, nous présentons.
Once the online consultation is over, we'll be making suggestions to the committee, and we could give feedback. We can also provide feedback that we will have heard during consultations with the provinces, territories, Indigenous groups, and other stakeholders. In my opinion, Canada's wild fisheries and pristine waters are the envy of the world. By engaging in genuine and meaningful consultation with Canadians, I'm confident that we'll be able to chart an appropriate and responsible path forward when it comes to safeguarding Canada's aquatic ecosystems. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cormier.
Move to questions, folks. Just further, since we have the cameras here, I'd like to, I know the Minister brought up the availability to have input towards the website departments. We also have the ability here within this committee, and I'd just like to remind everyone who's watching or in the room that we have a deadline of November 30th for written submissions to the committee itself. The website is www.parl.gc.ca. That's parl.gc.ca/committees, and search for FOPO, F-O-P-O, Fisheries and Ocean Pêche d'Océan. So, and again, the deadline is November 30th for your written submissions. That being said, we now go to questions, comments. Pour la première question,
First question goes to Mr. Finnegan. 7 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Minister, for coming here to discuss the changes to the Fisheries Act. And as the Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister said, fisheries is a very important for our region in the Gulf. Could the Minister comment on the fact that since the Fisheries Act was amended back in 2012, well, we could have simply gone back to the former Fisheries Act, but you decided to go further. Could you comment on why you did this? And what do we hope to accomplish with this new modernization of the Fisheries Act? Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you to Mr. Finnegan, thank you for your question. I'm going to say some words, but if my colleagues who have a great deal more expertise in the implementation of the Act have something to add, obviously I would be very pleased to let them answer. But your question is, why not simply go back to the wording of the former Act prior to 2012, 2013, before the most recent changes were made? We preferred to not simply limit ourselves to that. Scientists and individuals have said that it would be best to just cut and paste and put certain clauses in the new Act, but we think we can do better than that. The Prime Minister's mandate letter talks about modern protection matters, modern safeguards. So if we're talking about an act that went back to the 70s, well, we're talking about 40 years ago. But there are other factors that are now coming into play, such as climate change, traditional indigenous knowledge that cause us to have a different idea about what we mean when we talk about fish habitat protection. And Mr. Chair, we also want to hear from Canadians. We want to hear from experts what the fishing sector says, what aquaculture says. We heard about a musical concert that was canceled because of fisheries problems. We want to ensure that we understand how parliamentarians are thinking, and through you, Canadians. We're going to be doing other consultations as well. We don't change the Fisheries Act very often. We don't want to do this through an omnibus bill. We want to proceed in a very transparent fashion, and I think that your committee will be part of the conversation, but we believe that we can now provide safeguards appropriate to our time and not for 40 years ago. We have to look at what was there beforehand and look at the threshold. We want to ensure that we have a modern regime that is as strong as what was there before, but are there things that we need to add to it to improve it? And the last thing is, there are, in 2012, 2013, some amendments were positive in our opinion. So we don't simply want to strike out everything that was done. We want to improve it and keep those elements of the reform which we deemed to be good. Thank you very much. We visited the East Coast a month ago, and we stopped off at Miramichi, and we spoke to the First Nations there, and we talked about the Fisheries Act before 2012, and we asked about the changes that were made, and we heard the testimony of people who were saying that they said that they wanted to be consulted to greater length, and they want their experience to be incorporated into the new Act. Will we be making any commitments with our Indigenous communities that their views will be taken into consideration in this Act? The simple answer to your question, Mr. Chair, is yes. I had the privilege of being with our colleagues at a fisherman's powwow in Miramichi on July 1st in your riding. I met with the national chief of the First Nations on the Miramichi River. We had an opportunity with the member from Miramichi and myself to discuss matters with the chief and with other leaders, Aboriginal leaders in the region. And Mr. Chair, our colleague is quite right. These people want to be included in the conversation. They want to participate in the conversation. They have some ideas that really inspired me. We saw recently in Bella Bella, where I was on the weekend with the Halsik community. They are deeply committed to the environment. They want to protect it. They want to manage the marine resources responsibly. So we've had discussions with national organizations representing the Indigenous people, but it's an ongoing conversation, and I hope that these people will take advantage of the study that your committee is doing. But we're going to be very present. We are going to be consulting these groups very quickly. I'm also a farmer, and there, as you pointed out, there's an impact on agriculture. The drainage channels, for instance, have an impact on the fish. So we're having an impact on the Miramichi River. Are we going to work with farmers to ensure that farmers don't lose the ground that they need for planting? Once again, Mr. Chair, the answer is yes, of course. We do understand the concerns, the reasonable concerns of farmers. We've all heard past stories where that simply didn't make sense, so we would like to hear their concerns and ensure that we have strong protection for fish habitat and that there are no unexpected consequences where we heard that country musical concert in Saskatchewan that had to be cancelled. We wouldn't have thought that had anything to do with the Fisheries Act.
Go to the official opposition, Mr. Doherty, for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister. I'm going to ask you to be very concise with your answers if I can, because our time is short. Minister, how much value do you put on the work that this committee is doing?
A great deal.
The reason why I ask you that is that we have been given such a short timeline to do, and by your own words, you have stressed the importance of this Fisheries Act review to do a study on the Fisheries Act. And members on this side of the floor have asked time and again to go back to yourself and the Minister of Transportation to get more time so that we can truly do consultations. And with the announcement that you made October 18th of online consultations, and now you just sat here and you told us that you are consulting with First Nations, what I think is the right way of doing it, in meeting face-to-face, which we've asked for in this committee and been turned down and voted down. And then you've come to us and said that if we want the information, you'll share some with us and not all of it. Why not all? And what is the time frame that you'll give us that information?
Well, Mr. Doherty, or Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Doherty, perhaps you misunderstood. I said we'd be happy to share all that information, and I also indicated we'd share it at a time and in a way that the committee finds the most appropriate. So, Mr. Doherty, we're in your hands.
So then, with you being here, Minister LeBlanc, do you not think that we should actually do a true consultation rather than just a short time frame and rush this review?
It shouldn't surprise you, Mr. Doherty, that I wouldn't accept the premise of your question that you can't do a thorough and appropriate consultation and do so expeditiously. I recognize that the time frame is not unlimited, but I also recognize that Canadians that I heard from and that our government heard from were increasingly unhappy and concerned about what was the perceived weakening of these protections.
Mr. LeBlanc, I'm just asking you on the time frame, just short and sweet. Do you not think that this committee should have more time to study this?
Well, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't propose to dictate to a committee how much time you take to study and what particular issue you wish to study. I wrote to the committee giving you an indication of what, as a government, we feel is a responsible time frame in order, and let's understand something. Once we get a report from your committee, I hope that we can draft legislation, and I will undertake to do that as quickly as I can through the cabinet approval process, which requires some time. But we will respond. Mr. Doherty, I didn't interrupt your question. Let me finish the answer.
Short and sweet. I've only got a short time.
But you'll have a second round, and I'm happy to come back at another time that's convenient. So, Mr. Chair, my only point would be we are going to draft legislation. We will undertake to respond to your committee's report, not wait the 120 days or the maximum
Mr. Chair,
amount of
it's
time.
my time, so I'd like to cut the minister off so we can get to our round of questioning, if with all due respect.
Mr. Doherty, just hold on a second. Mr. Doherty, the time is yours. You can do it, and the minister is certainly can answer the way he chooses.
Minister LeBlanc, I'm going to shift
Now we go to time.
I'm going to shift on this for you. I want to talk real quickly on moratorium. Time and again, you've stood in the House. We've had conversations about your government shifting to formalizing a moratorium on the West Coast. We know that there is an extreme amount of oil tankers, foreign oil tankers on the eastern side. Mr. Irving himself seems quite confident that the Energy East pipeline will be approved through you, through the chair to the minister, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. Why is it okay for this to take place on the East Coast, not the West Coast? And have you done an economic study on what a moratorium on the West Coast would that economic impact?
So, Mr. Chairman, obviously I haven't had any conversations with Mr. Irving about what Mr. Doherty indicates he said. I take it at face value. If Mr. Doherty read that into the record, it must be accurate. I haven't had those conversations, obviously. We made a commitment to Canadians in the election campaign to have a moratorium on oil tankers on the northwest coast of British Columbia. We campaigned on that in a very open and transparent way. We won a majority government and 17 seats.
So will the same apply for the East Coast? Will you consider a moratorium on the East Coast then?
Mr. Doherty, I'm endeavoring to answer your questions, but the constant interrupting does not make it very possible to answer your questions.
Please proceed.
Thank you. We made a very solemn commitment to Canadians that we would have a tanker moratorium. I know you're probably excited to learn the details of that, and I hope in the coming days we'll have more information for Canadians and British Columbians on exactly how that would be operationalized. The Minister of Transport obviously has the lead on that. I've been working with him in order to put in place the appropriate measures. And we are constantly interested in hearing from Canadians who have concerns about environmental protections and the best way we can safely navigate in Canadian waters. The level of concern that allowed us to make that commitment to Canadians was specific to the west coast of British Columbia, the northwest coast of British Columbia. But if your committee wants to make a recommendation for us to look at other measures to improve marine safety and ensure the protection of the environment, we would obviously welcome those suggestions.
Have you consulted with our provincial colleagues in British Columbia on the coming announcement in the coming days?
I have ongoing conversations with the government of British Columbia. My counterpart, Minister Letnick, is somebody with whom I have ongoing conversations. I knew Premier Clark when she was an assistant in Ottawa when I worked for Mr. Chrétien 20 years ago. We were young assistants on Parliament Hill together, and I've kept in touch with her and maintained a friendship with her for 20 years, and I'm in touch with her regularly as well.
Okay. Much more time?
You got 30 seconds.
I'll end it at that.
Duly noted. Okay. Now, Mr. Donnelly for 7 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur President, and
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Parliamentary Secretary and our esteemed officials to be here as well, answering our questions. So, Minister, I'd like to start off with a few questions on the Fisheries Act and specifically the Section 35. So, your party campaigned, as did ours, to restore the environmental protections immediately. In your new term, and specifically with the protections of restoring Section 35 of the Fisheries Act within, I take that to be within 100 days. So that's what I think is immediate. Obviously, that might be open to discretion. And since that time, since the election, there has been 35 organizations, national environmental organizations, individuals, First Nations that have written to the minister stating their concern, that they want to reverse the changes that were made in 2012 under the Harper regime that essentially gutted the Fisheries Act. There has been a petition from the West Coast Environmental Law. Over 10,000 signatures essentially calling for that. It's been over a year in office. Still, we have the 2012, essentially the gutted Fisheries Act in place. We've had a review of the Site C dam go through under that. We will see the Kinder Morgan application go through under that same regime. How do you see the immediately restoring the Fisheries Act and specifically the HAD that we're now involved in a consultation which was going to take us into next year as being immediately?
Well, so thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Donnelly, for your question. Maybe we have it right. If you thought we could have done it in 100 days and your colleague from the Conservative Party thinks we need to take more time, maybe somewhere if we land in the middle we have it right. But I do share, Mr. Donnelly, your concern. I have taken note of what was an impressive list of scientists, Indigenous leaders, and others who urged us to move very quickly. And I think I was trying to express, perhaps imperfectly, that we share their concerns, and we don't see this as an interminable process or as something that should drag on and drag on. But we do believe that one of the reasons why there was such a frustration with the changes that were made in 2012 and 2013 is precisely because they were made without any consultation and, frankly, through a parliamentary procedure with your party and with which we agreed wasn't very democratic or transparent. So we're trying to find the happy medium in moving quickly and expeditiously. That's why we thought things like the online portal, and over 5,000 people have visited that particular site since we launched it. The work that your committee has generously undertaken to do should dovetail in a way that we can move quickly. As I say, I'm undertaking not to wait the 120 days or whatever it is that the government would have to respond to a report. We're going to follow closely the work of your committee as a department in order that when we get your report with the recommendations, we can respond as quickly as possible. I'll do something which is probably not wise. My hope is in a perfect world we'd have legislation that we could table before the end of the spring session in 2017. There are reasons why that may get delayed, but it certainly wouldn't be my hope. I hope that we can, as a department, can move quickly. And then, Mr. Donnelly, we would again be in the hands of the House and parliamentarians if we could find a way to have a quick debate at second reading in the House of Commons and send the bill to your committee for study and improvement. If you find ways to improve our legislation, if you adduce evidence from people that have a better way to protect fish habitat, we remain open to that. So I hope it's a collaborative process, but I recognize the frustration that people have. But as I said in response to Mr. Finnegan, we didn't want to just cut and paste what was there before, because there are a few elements of the reforms with which we agreed. And there are also perhaps ways to... The Fisheries Act will not get opened up many times in a parliament. It's quite rare. So we want to do it and try and do it as best we can, and hopefully it'll last for a generation if the previous one lasted for 2.
Thank you. And I think there's 2 issues at play here. One is the immediate restoration of the habitat protection. So that's the HAD, the harmful alteration, disruption, and destruction of fish habitat. And I think that's what Canadians were wanting reversed. And to take a year and a half to do that, I think they find, as do I, that unacceptable. Now we're in a process of not just looking at the HAD, and Minister, you mentioned it, we're looking at concerns around the changes, improvements to the Act, science and traditional ecological knowledge, future realities including climate change, current penalties, and I think there are others. So that is well beyond looking at just the habitat protection. So that, I think, is the frustrations, and I think we've even had that at this committee, is what exactly are we looking at? Because I think from the government members, I've heard that we're just looking at habitat protections. But what is on the website, what is opened up to Canadians is, and what you have mentioned today at committee, is far broader than that. And so I do share some of the concerns on this side in terms of, if you're going to open up the Fisheries Act, which you've just mentioned, and I agree, is one of the most fundamental pieces of legislation in this country when it comes to protecting the fishery, is there needs to be adequate time. So for instance, we've had over 80 people and organizations that want to come and speak on this matter because of the broad nature of this, not just on the habitat protections, which is of a critical nature, but on the modernizing of the Act, etc. So that is, I think, a different issue. Meantime, we have major energy projects, other projects, projects going through municipalities, etc., that are being approved under the Gutted Fisheries Act, i.e. with those less habitat protections. So can you clarify what we're actually looking at? I think you actually have in your opening remarks that this committee, which you have written to essentially direct this committee to look at the Fisheries Act, can you clarify that we're looking at beyond the habitat protections, and we're looking at, and maybe if you could speak specifically to what you mean by modernizing the Act?
Mr. Donnelly, sorry, Minister, to interrupt, but you're pretty much out of time. I'm going to have to ask you, I'm going to provide some flexibility here, Minister, if you could just provide a short response to that. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. I agree with Mr. Donnelly that restoring lost protections, which was the campaign commitment we made and the mandate instruction I have, is principally around restoring the habitat protections which were weakened. I think that was the flashpoint of the previous conversation. That's where we believe the most important work has to be done. When I say modernize, I think what I mean is, how does a modern habitat protection legislative framework operate in 2017 as opposed to 1977? And I would hope that your committee, and I obviously don't want to disagree with you, Mr. Donnelly, but I didn't direct the committee. That was a word you used. I would obviously disagree with that. I wrote to the committee asking if you'd consider this, and I was very pleased that you accepted to do so. I wouldn't purport to direct the committee, and I wouldn't purport to tell you what you should study and what you should report on. I look forward to your deliberations, but share your focus on the habitat piece. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I have the duty to move things along. So, Mr. Hardy, we're going to you for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Well, let's talk about modernization then and just keep going on that theme. But first, just confirming, because some of my colleagues on my other committee in transport came in with the attitude that the minister had already made up his mind, because in the mandate letter it just said restore the protection, case closed. But I understand that that's not the case. Your mind is not made up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to Mr. Hardy. Absolutely not. My mind is made up, and our government's mind is made up based on a commitment we made in the campaign, and on which we won a platform on which we won a majority government, including 17 seats in your great province, Mr. Hardy, which made us very happy on election night.
Me too.
We do believe that restoring lost protections is a commitment that we hope and intend to honor. It's a legislative commitment, so obviously we need the support of parliamentarians, both in our House and next door in the Senate. So I'm not naive as to the legislative process. But I'm also, I come here with an open mind, and that's why I value so much the work that you're going to do and other ways that Canadians can share their ideas, because we, I hope, can arrive at a modern, responsible, balanced way to protect fish and fish habitat in 2017 that Canadians care so deeply about. And how we best do that, I'm wide open to the suggestions that your committee will have, or other people, and wide open to working collaboratively with you once we get a draft, a bill that we present to the House, and send it through the normal parliamentary process for improvements.
Okay, then one of the things that I've heard, some of it through the witnesses we've had here and in the other committee, and certainly people that have been speaking to me, in modernizing the Act, they're looking for ways to empower themselves, and themselves being the commercial fishers and the recreational stakeholders. They want to participate more in stock and habitat protection. Any comments, any thoughts on the direction we could go to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Hardy, you're absolutely right. I've heard some of those same desires on my travels across the country, including in your province. recreational fisheries sector in your province is well organized, well structured, has a long-standing tradition of partnership with our department. Commercial fisheries, the same thing, Indigenous groups. These are the people whose livelihood and whose passion depends on the success and the health of these fish stocks. So they have a very real personal interest in getting it right. And they also have, in the case of long-time commercial fishers or sports fishers or certainly Indigenous groups, a vast body of knowledge of what works, what doesn't work, where has it been successful in the past, where has perhaps improvements have been made. So we welcome any chance to partner with these groups. If we're going to get it right, it's because these groups believe that we found the right balance and the best way to ensure the best possible protection. Laws and the respect of laws often depend on the confidence that people have in those laws. And one of the things I should share with your committee, Mr. Chair, is the successive budget cuts at Fisheries and Oceans over a number of years have put us in the position, and I'm seeking to rectify this with my colleagues at the Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, where even if we had a better, more robust legislative framework, as I hope we get to, we will need increased resources around habitat protection, monitoring, enforcement. I talked about that in June when Mr. Garneau and I had a brief announcement about how we were hoping to proceed. But I'm also conscious that the legislative text is one thing, but we need both in our department and other government agencies, and who better to partner with us than the people whose livelihoods depend on these resources, a much higher degree of integration and collaboration, and frankly, boots on the ground in many cases to do the monitoring, to do the enforcement. Can have the best laws on the books, but if nobody ever gets charged because you don't have the ability to investigate and prosecute offenses, the laws are illusory, and it leaves people with a false sense that you've done something, and that's certainly not what we're intending to do.
Do I have any time left, sir? Oh, great. When we talk about modernizing habitat protection, talk about consideration, and I'll repeat this question to the staff when we have a chance to chat with them, but your own thoughts. The impact of aquaculture on fish habitat. It's a big issue, a big question that remains unresolved, mostly due to the lack of science, especially on the West Coast. My East Coast folks can speak for themselves on this one. Your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Hardy, you're absolutely right. There is certainly from my perspective, and you would know your province and Mr. Donnelly and Mr. Doherty and others better than I would, but there is a heightened public concern around the potential impact of aquaculture on wild fish stocks. We should not be naive about that. I know Mr. Donnelly has strongly held views on that and has a legislation before the House of Commons now that was debated, I think, last evening for the first time. So we recognize, as you said, Mr. Hardy, also that part of the reassurance for Canadians that understandably are concerned is that we have the most robust, transparent, publicly accessible, scientific, peer-reviewed information that is available to Canadians. I shared with our colleagues in the Senate yesterday. They have done a report on the aquaculture industry, their Fisheries Committee, which I thought was quite instructive. And I had the privilege of going to Senate question period yesterday, and in answer to some questions from our colleagues, I have told them, and I told the Senate committee, that we would be open to looking at the possibility of a National Aquaculture Act, for example. How does that work, and in what capacity obviously remains. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're not on the eve of doing that, but I'm prepared to begin the conversation, including with provinces and the industry and scientific groups, to see, many of them have advocated for that, how might that work, and we would obviously at some future point want to come back before this committee, but that might be part of the medium or long-term answer too.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. That concludes the first round of questioning. Something I neglected to do at the beginning, I will do now. That is, as you know, we were delayed by approximately 10 minutes for a good reason. We paid tribute to the athletes of the Olympics and Paralympics. Because of that, I'm seeking unanimous consent to extend this meeting by 10 minutes for 5:40 Eastern Time. Do I say all in favor of extending? Any objections? None. And we will be adjourned in time to get to the votes which are just down the hall, including the vote on my Seal Products Day bill, which you've just witnessed as an unsolicited comment and promotion for my own bill. Yes, Mr.
I have an event in Montreal, so I'm going to miss the great privilege of voting for that bill. But I want you to know, Mr. Chair, that Canadians are pleased that that legislation is being voted on tonight.
Thank you for that. So thank you also for that promotion. That's very good. Sorry you couldn't be there. Now we go to Mr. Sopik for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I was really disappointed in the testimony from the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary for a couple of reasons, because the words farmer and municipalities were not mentioned in either of your testimonies. And when I heard the latest comments on agriculture and farming, farmers being charged under the Fisheries Act is something I think they should be worried about. And I know that the farm groups, and I'm very close to all of them across the country, are very concerned about what the government is possibly doing to the Fisheries Act. I should make the point as well, and I'm going to go on the record, this notion that there are no habitat protections in our new Fisheries Act is completely disingenuous. The Act says, Section 35, it's against carrying on of a work, undertaking, or activity that results in serious harm to fish that are part of a commercial, recreation, or aboriginal fishery. Serious harm is defined as the death of fish or the permanent alteration to or destruction of fish habitat, with fish habitat defined a certain way. So to suggest that there are no habitat protections in the revised Fisheries Act is not quite correct. And I would quote from one of the officials in the room here, Mr. Kevin Stringer, who on November the 6th, 2012, when questioned in our committee regarding habitat, he said that, yes, that's correct. That's still the case under Section 35. Because if you look at the definition of serious harm, which is in Section 2, serious harm to fish is defined as the death of the fish or the permanent alteration or destruction of habitat. So it was quite clear at the official level in the department, there was no suggestion that there were no habitat provisions in the Act whatsoever. The habitat provisions in the Act are still there. I have a question. What quantitative evidence is there? And when I mean quantitative evidence, I mean values and numbers that suggest that the alterations, the changes to the Fisheries Act had any measurable effect on any fish population or community in Canada. And I'm specifically asking for numbers. What effect did the changes have on fisheries populations in Canada?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sopik. Obviously, we share the concerns and we understand the concerns, and we're certainly not seeking to diminish the concerns of the agricultural sector. I have colleagues in my caucus and my colleague Lawrence McCulley and others who have been quite vocal about understanding the legitimate concerns of producers and agricultural businesses across the country. So I hope that your committee will consider that and will hear from these groups. And we would welcome an opportunity to benefit from your advice on how we can do that. I wouldn't have suggested, I hope you didn't misunderstand me, I wouldn't have suggested that there were no habitat protections in what, no, that wasn't my word. I think what I would have said is that we think we can strengthen them, improve them, modernize them, restore some protections that were lost. But we can discuss the semantics. I think we all can do a better job of improving the legislation. Mr. Sopik referenced some comments from Mr. Stringer. We're really lucky that he's here today, and he might be in a position to speak to that. But more importantly, because your question also, Mr. Sopik, I think is very good around what are specific examples where these changes may have had an impact. But I think we can all agree that various fish stocks run into various difficult circumstances for various reasons. Habitat protection.
If I could, as you know, Minister, I'm a fisheries biologist. I've been a fisheries biologist for 40 years. And so the notion that fish populations fluctuate is something I'm quite familiar with. So I asked other witnesses in the previous meeting to give me some evidence about any quantitative evidence of harm that the new act had on any fish community, and nobody could. And I gather from the answer that nobody has the number.
No, Mr. Sopak, the good news is Mr. Stringer can do that for you right now. So
okay,
let's ask Mr. Stringer.
And I want a quantitative estimate of the damage, of any harm that may have been done by the changes we made to the Fisheries Act.
No, I appreciate that. The data that I would offer, I think, is speaks to. We don't have specific data on quantitatively in terms of impacts. That is something that if you're looking at a modernized provisions, it would be nice to have the regulatory authority, but also the resources to be able to do that. But what we do have is evidence in terms of some of the reductions that we've seen in the past few years. The amount of engagement, the referrals that we've got under the new act, the requests for information, the requests for our engagement, the letters of advice that we've sent out, the authorizations that we've provided, the charges that have been brought forward have all decreased.
With all due respect, that's not what I asked. I'm asking about the fish themselves. So obviously, by both of the answers to my question, there is no evidence whatsoever that the changes that we brought to the Fisheries Act had made any material difference negatively to any fish community. Also, I would like to ask, did the
Mr.
department...
Sopak, I'm going to have to clue up very quickly. Go ahead.
Did the department do any analysis of the changes to the Fisheries Act, a written report, and with our government or the new government? And I would like to know who wrote that report, if a report was written, and can we have that person testify before the committee? Because we're going to take the Liberal government at its word, because in the last election campaign, it was committed to eliminate all regulations that censor government scientists, giving them the freedom to speak about the work. So I would like to know, was an analysis done of the changes to the Fisheries Act, and can we have the name of the person who did the analysis and have them appear before our committee, as per the Liberal commitment to openness?
Very quickly, Minister, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there are about 5 or 6 questions. I would hope, Mr. Sopak, your enthusiasm for open and transparent science would allow you to ask that question to the scientific people that will appear before the committee. Ask them if they feel less muzzled today than they did 2 years ago. I think that would be an instructive line of questioning, and I would encourage you to do so.
Thank you, Minister. And now we go to Ms. Jordan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to thank the Minister for appearing today. And although not only you, this is actually the 3rd time in 9 months that the Minister has appeared before this committee, and I do appreciate the Department being willing to come and speak to us, and I know that that's something that's been a long time coming, so I appreciate that. So moving on to our questions. In our meeting on Monday, we heard that greater data sharing between DFO and partner organizations will allow for greater understanding of the status of our fish stocks. Given that the mandate letter says that government and its information should be open by default, will the government continue to make more of DFO's information available to foster the greater understanding of fisheries and the oceans?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Jordan, the answer is yes. I know a number of members of this committee had a chance to meet one of the leading environmental groups, Oceana, that had a conference in Ottawa last week, I think. I had the privilege of speaking at the opening of the session on Wednesday, actually a week ago today. And I undertook to make scientific information and data much more available, and available in a user-friendly way. Not all of us have the advantage of a detailed scientific background. I think Canadians share a huge amount of concern that governments and everyone involved needs to do the best they can at protecting fish and fish habitat, and they want to understand where are the areas of concern, what can we do better. It starts by making scientific and other analyses open and available by default. I announced that we would be doing exactly that. We'd be sort of putting a report card that this group had asked our department to do across, I think, 159 species. And we're also preparing, and quite quickly, to put the historical data as well. In other words, to go backwards and also make that available. And I committed to doing it, I think, every 6 months or once a year? Once a year, annually. But if we're in a position to do so biannually, obviously, or semi-annually rather, we'd be happy to do so. So we're making the best efforts we can, Ms. Jordan, to open up more scientific data, but we recognize there's more work that can be done. And if your committee has suggestions after you hear from witnesses or you hear from Canadians of what specific areas of concern there are in terms of access to this information, again, it doesn't have to be a formal recommendation, but if colleagues have suggestions for me, I'll work with the department to try and alleviate these concerns and raise our game as best as we possibly can. One of the concerns we have is over the last 5 years, the department has suffered a series of budget cuts, $35 million, which led to almost 1,100 positions being eliminated in the department. Now, if you think about 1,100 positions over the last 5 years, many of these were frontline enforcement people, habitat protection people, scientific people. So we're also working within the financial structure we have to remedy that as well, and that will take us to a better place, we hope, as well.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that was my next question, because we've heard that as an overarching problem. This is our fourth study, and we've heard that the cuts to DFO, both in science and enforcement, have been a real detriment to the boots on the ground people. We know that there's been an investment in science. We're happy to see that, and I really hope that we continue on and do see that investment in enforcement, because it's critical in terms of how we move forward with DFO. So one of the other things that we heard on Monday about the changes to the Fisheries Act outlined habitat protection regime and moved more to a fisheries protection regime. Do you see the distinction between habitat protection and fisheries protection, and should the Fisheries Act be focused more on one than the other?
Again, I'll offer a very quick comment, Ms. Jordan, and perhaps Mr. Stringer or Philippe Morel can add something, because I do recognize that is a significant but precise distinction. And I wouldn't want to offer you an uninformed view that would lead to a misunderstanding. I think what Canadians expect from their governments is to have the most effective, the most robust, and as you said, the most appropriately resourced structures to ensure that those who do damage to fish habitat or who harm fish or fish habitat face the consequences. But that we also have the appropriate prevention measures in place to try and alleviate the worst case scenario where there is some long-term damage. But in terms of the distinction between the two, I don't know if Mr. Stringer or Mr. Morel peut-être ont des commentaires ajoutés.
I'll add to it. Thanks, Minister.
Very quickly, please.
The Minister, yeah. So there are 5, it's fisheries. And in the Fisheries Act, there are 5 threats to fisheries, okay, that are addressed in the Fisheries Act. Pollution is under Section 36, dealt with by Environment Canada. Overfishing, and we have fisheries management sections. Aquatic invasive species, and we have the enabling of a regulation there. Fish passage, and that's sections 20 to 22, and habitat. Habitat is absolutely critical, and that Section 35 provision speaks to fisheries, but really that's the key where we need the habitat protected. There are elements in the Fisheries Act that address those other things.
Okay, thank you very much. We now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister and the Deputy Minister for being here today, or Parliamentary Secretary, pardon me. First of all, I'd like to make a statement to correct a statement made by the member across the way about the vote that took place regarding the deadline for this. I have asked personally for this deadline to be extended. I would not have voted in favor of, and it would not have been a unanimous vote in favor of the date that was stated. So I want to make that clarification. The vote may have been unanimous on one side of this committee, but not entirely. Mr. Minister, back on October 18th, there was a press release went out from your ministry saying that feedback heard through the consultation of the online process will be provided to the Parliamentary Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This committee will consider all feedback as part of its recommendation for changes to the Fisheries Act. Is that correct?
Sure. As I said, Mr. Arnold, or Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Arnold, we're wide open to providing you what information you need in the way that you find most useful. So we would welcome your suggestions.
Okay, thank you. What members of the Fisheries Committee were notified of this commitment by you, made on behalf of the committee prior to the news release going out?
I'm not sure I follow your question.
Were any of the committee members notified that this was a commitment on of the committee made by you on our behalf?
I can't speak to any personal involvement I've had in that. It's an interesting question. I can undertake to see if there were conversations, but I'm going by memory. I speak to the people in front of you on the table many times a day on a whole bunch of issues. I don't have a recollection of that, but if it's a source of great concern, we can provide some better information if in fact that exists.
Okay. Now, upon what authority did you have as minister to base this commitment that the committee would consider all feedback as part of their recommendations?
So I'll offer a quick comment. The deputy, I think, will add something. I wouldn't assume that a committee as enlightened as yours doing work on something as important as the Fisheries Act wouldn't consider all the information you have. So I just assume that parliamentary committees do a thorough and detailed analysis of all the information, and you decide what information you would like to follow or not. But the deputy may have something specific to add. Catherine?
Yeah. Thank you, Minister. Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. And what I'd like to offer is potentially the wording in that release, frankly, was not as respectful of the committee as it might have been. It should have probably said the committee may, as opposed to will. So that would, my apologies, that I take responsibility for that. That's a departmental communications tool, so for that I'm sorry. It wouldn't in any way ever want to demand or expect anything of the committee, so our apologies. I would say it should be may, if you're interested.
We also note that that press release was revised and that section was completely removed from there. What efforts have been made to inform the public that that information or that feedback may not be provided or may not be considered by the public or by the committee?
So if you don't mind, I'll follow up on that. So it's been picked up on, but for sure we'll make that correction.
Thank you. I'll split my remaining time with Mr. Doherty.
Direct my comments to the Minister. Minister, your government has announced a carbon tax. Has there been an economic impact study that carbon tax will, how it would impact the fisheries or those people, those friends and families that depend on fisheries for their livelihood?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Doherty. As you know, we made a clear commitment to Canadians in the election that we think there should be a price on pollution. We're working in a constructive...
Was there an economic impact study on that?
Again, I'd be happy to get precise information and get back to you on that. That would be a question, Mr. Doherty. Take advantage...
Mr. Chair, pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans conduct a pre-budget. I'm asking, putting forward a motion that the Committee on Fisheries and Oceans conduct a pre-budget study on the effects that the price of carbon or price on carbon announced by the Prime Minister on October 3rd, 2016 would have on the fisheries sector in Canada, that this study be comprised of no less than 4 meetings to be held at the committee's earliest convenience, that the department officials from Fisheries and Oceans Canada be in attendance for at least 1 meeting, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House of Commons.
In order, we have the appropriate notice beforehand. You did bring this to the committee. We now have it being distributed through to all of the committee members. Once again, if you don't already have it, I'll open up the floor for a discussion on that. Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully support this motion. It's going to have huge impact. I've recently made trips out to the Maritimes, spoken with fishermen there. Many of them were almost unaware or totally unaware of the impacts of the carbon tax, and to be honest, they went through the roof when they found out what it was going to cost them in extra fuel costs.
Okay. Any more comment on this? Seeing none,
Mr. Chair, I think we should just go to the vote.
Indeed, we will. Seeing that the debate is exhausted, we now go to the vote. All in favor of Mr. Doherty's motion, please raise your hand. All those opposed to Mr. Doherty's motion? Abstentions? I see that the motion defeated. We will now proceed. Now, in seeing that, we have 30 seconds left, Mr. Doherty, in your questioning.
To the minister and to the parliamentary secretary, with all due respect, I do want to offer that we do deeply respect what you do and your offices, and you've been very kind in your time in the short time that I've been in this file. So although we are combative at times, or it seems like the questioning seems combative, we do have deep respect for both of you. So.
Mr. Doherty, that sentiment, we're sort of ahead of ourselves. It's not Valentine's Day yet. It was Halloween this week. But that sentiment is mutual, and I've enjoyed our conversations. And frankly, this is an issue. What's fun about this portfolio is that there's interactions on all of the coast of Canada. I'm learning about the Great Lakes fisheries. I'm learning from colleagues on all sides of the House. So it's an exciting thing to discover, and I look forward to working with all of you as well.
There we go. I'd love to say we can end on that note, but I suspect we will not. We now have to proceed. Mr. MacDonald, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and Parliamentary Secretary and staff for coming here today. Minister, I wonder if you could help clarify something. I guess there's been a lot of discussion, and even here today, about extending the time that's allowed to review the changes that may take place under the Act and the consultation process and whatnot. And I do know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you were a parliamentarian here when the last revision came through under the Section 35. Can you recall or be able to inform the committee here today about how much consultation or how much review time and what kind of time was allowed available for the previous review of the Act in 2012?
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you, and thank you, Mr. MacDonald, for that question. Your chair was also a member of Parliament, as were a number of other colleagues at the table when these changes were done in 2012 and 2013. To say that there was a review of the Fisheries Act changes, I think, would be, Mr. MacDonald, a pretty gross exaggeration. These were measures that were largely buried in an omnibus budget bill, hundreds and hundreds of pages long. We didn't think that that was the right way, and that sentiment was shared by a number of parliamentarians in the House of Commons. I know that the New Democrats, to be fair, the Bloc Québécois, to be fair, Ms. May, the Green Party, became very concerned about it. I think Ms. May, in fact, had us voting for 30-some or 38 hours or something on some of these bills to draw Canadians' attention to this abusive process around omnibus budget bills suddenly changing fundamental protections of the Fisheries Act that are important, as you will see and as we are seeing to many Canadians. So that's why we thought that asking your committee, and that's why we were so happy that you accepted, asking your committee to undertake this work, and then making deliberate amendments to the Fisheries Act in a transparent way, going through the regular parliamentary process. We'll hear from colleagues at every stage of the debate. The ultimate bill that we would table in the House of Commons, we hope and believe, would be referred to this very committee, and you will then decide in your own wisdom how you wish to proceed with that legislation, from whom you wish to hear, and we would encourage you to hear from a variety of voices and to try and not leave anybody out who feels strongly about this on any side of the question, because the best way, we believe, to build legislation that enjoys a high level of public confidence is to do so in a transparent and democratic way. Doesn't mean we always agree on it. Democracy begins and ends with a vote, but the process in between can be collegial and informative and transparent and open, and that's certainly what we're hoping for.
I'll take that lengthy answer as none, as being the answer. But, Minister, since 2012, municipalities in my riding have expressed concerns that during construction and development in their communities, habitat management has become self-regulated. That responsibility has been downloaded to municipalities. What are your thoughts on that issue in itself?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. McDonald. You're right. It's not only in your great riding of Avalon that elected municipal leaders, and in some cases provincial leaders, would feel this sense of downloading. I've seen it in my province. Serge and I represent New Brunswick constituencies. We hear the same thing from municipal leaders. As I said, perhaps in response to your colleague, Ms. Jordan, the serious sort of layers of reductions at the Fisheries and Oceans Department have meant that often it was, and back to Mr. Finnegan's question, it was community groups, volunteer groups, NGOs, environmental groups, municipal leaders that stepped in and tried to provide monitoring, tried to shed some light on perhaps practices that they thought may have been negative, and tried to get the responsible public authorities to take their responsibility. But in the case of our department, as the deputy just tells me, we went from 63 offices doing fisheries habitat protection down to 16. So don't be surprised if the people in Avalon perhaps found that it was harder to get to one of those offices, and therefore goodwill citizens and other community leaders stepped in. That's why if we get this right and build public confidence, and if we are successful convincing our cabinet colleagues, the deputy and I and others, for a better allocation of resources to support this work, hopefully people won't have the sense that they're having stuff downloaded on them. That certainly isn't our intention, but we recognize that we're some distance away from having solved that yet.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Donnelly, for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, the Fisheries Act gives you the authority to manage the fishery not only for conservation and the sustainability of fish, but also in the pursuit of social and economic objectives. And the Canadian Independent Fish Harvesters Federation have a concern, and they've asked, in the absence of such a clear statement in the legislation, which they feel it creates some ambiguity regarding the authority of the minister, and whether the Act implements the full scope of the government's jurisdiction and power in that regard. So I'm wondering if your thoughts in the short time that I have, if you can comment about the specifics of putting that in the legislation.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Donnelly. I've heard from some of these same representatives of independent harvesters. I'm sure you have. They've shared that concern with me. I think from your question that you probably have a similar view to mine, that the economic and social and cultural livelihood of many communities and up and down all the coast depend on the successful management of these resources. These are the men and women who are on the front line of any mismanagement decisions or any lack of rigorous scientific advice or whatever process leads to an unfortunate decision. They're often the first people to face the consequences. Many of them are economically in a situation where they don't have a whole series of other alternatives to support their families or to grow their communities. So I share that view, and I would again welcome the advice of the committee how you think we can square that circle. I, for a bunch of reasons, are attached to things like the owner-operator principle and a number of, and fleet separation. These are ideas that I hear about from the fishers and harvesters in my own riding and from colleagues of mine at the table here and elsewhere. But I'll be governed by the committee's view on these issues. And if you have suggestions, specific suggestions of how we can better reflect some of these values in the Act, I would welcome them.
And just a short question with the remaining time is, since under the new Fisheries Act 2012, have there been any private prosecutions that you're aware of? Has it been tested in court at all?
My understanding, Mr. Donnelly, is no. In a discussion with the senior officials, some of whom are with me today, yesterday, I wondered how various appeal courts had looked at certain sections of the new Act or of the changes, and have they been tested at various courts of appeal, and was surprised to learn no, they hadn't been, which speaks frankly to the lack of prosecutorial capacity, either because the legislation was drafted in a way that lawyers didn't believe they could successfully lay a charge, and or the cuts and reductions at the department and for monitoring and enforcement were such that we didn't have that capacity, or a combination of all those factors. But So I think the answer, Mr. Donnelly, is no. But if we find, and we'll triple check that, if we find that that's not a completely accurate answer, we'd be happy to get back to you. But if you don't hear from us, it's because the answer is no. Thank you.
Okay, that being said, as is tradition here, we tend to, since we're completed 2 rounds now, we'll go back to the format of the first round, giving 7 minutes to each of the 3 parties. We're going to start with the governing party, and I think Mr. Morrissey, for 7 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought I was having 3. My question to the Minister, it was stated by a previous witness that changes to Section 35 of the Fishery Act contained unscientific language that allowed for overly broad interpretation. And indeed, your own comments, Minister, you referenced confusion on what is protected now as a result of that. Could you elaborate on that a bit more? Was there consultation when the process took place, or this ambiguous language that's in there is leading to a confusion on what's protected, what's not?
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Morrissey. That question, I think, is a very, very accurate one, in the sense that when we believe that the scope of the protections, the breadth of the protections was narrowed, ambiguous language in a statute is often resolved or clarified by various court decisions. As I say, there haven't been enough of these court decisions to provide that clarity. We're hoping that Parliament will change the legislation to provide a greater degree of clarity. Section 35, which concerns serious harm to fish, moved from what had previously been a broad prohibition from activities that would result in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And now, in our view, the prohibition is scoped down and applies to activities that would result in serious harm to fish that are part of commercial, recreational, or Aboriginal fisheries, or fish that support those fisheries. So this change effectively, in our view, narrowed the scope of the application of Section 35 and the number of species, or even, as I said in my opening comments, Mr. Morrissey, the bodies of water that might be subject to the provisions of this Act. But it is a technical and a very, I think, important question. I don't know if Mr. Stringer briefly could add something, and if you want more information, we'd be happy to get back to you.
So I think there's 3 areas in that Section 35 that have led to confusion, questions, uncertainty. The first one is commercial, recreation, and Aboriginal fishery, because previously it was just everything. Now it is commercial, recreation, and Aboriginal fishery. What exactly does that mean? There's definitions in the Act, but we don't have the jurisprudence to say exactly what that means. Does it have to be actively fished, or is it subject to a license, etc.? The second one is, or fish that support such a fishery. Is that just the prey? Is it 2 or 3 trophic levels down? What exactly do we mean? What exactly is meant by that? Same question. And the third is serious harm. And serious harm is defined as the death of the fish, pretty certain, or permanent harm or disruption of habitat. What is permanent alteration of habitat as opposed to temporary? How permanent do you have to be to get to permanent? So there have been questions, whereas the previous Section 35 was pretty blunt in terms of any harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of habitat anywhere. So you've got those 3 sets of issues, trying to get at fisheries in there, but it does create some uncertainty.
Mr. Chair, my next question leads to that, because it's the confusion area that, and I have to speak for the farmers that I represent as well, and this is where you get the concern coming from the farm community. It's on the confusion in this section where what is the waterways that they sometimes alter or change, because you get more of that from the farm community. Could you comment on that, Mr.?
And again, Mr. Chair, Mr. Morrissey, you're absolutely right. In my own constituency, and you have a long experience on Prince Edward Island with the agricultural community, we've heard their concerns. We share their concerns. We're seeking to protect fish and fish habitat. We're not seeking to provide inadvertently some undue regulatory or legislative regime on agricultural practices. Now, there may be the very rare circumstances where there's an overlap or where there's an intersection. I think I've heard anecdotal examples, we all have. Sometimes it might be a lack of judgment or common sense on the part of a particular enforcement officer or person that perhaps didn't have what he or she thought was the sufficient authority to come up with an appropriate solution. I mean, some of it can be good faith human error or human judgment errors. But in some cases, if there's a legislative provision that would allow something that would appear completely unreasonable to take shape, that would not be something that we would condone or we would want to see. So I think we would benefit again, and I think this in response to Mr. Sopak, we would benefit from your committee's advice on how exactly we square that circle. And if you have experience, Mr. Finnegan ran a business called Monsieur Tomate in New Brunswick for a long time, including in my constituency. There is a lot of experience at this table with respect to agricultural issues, so we would benefit from your wisdom on that as well.
Do I have time for one question?
You do. In 1 minute.
Mr. Minister, you raised the subject, which is near and dear to a lot of our hearts, the owner-operator policy. You referenced it. It's part of the Fishery Act. We're looking at habitat, but I do think in some cases owner-operated policy does have an impact on habitat, significant one. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure, and I just referenced it sort of in respect to a question that Mr. Donnelly, the independent fish harvesters, some of whom I met last week, raised it with me. That was one of the main things they wanted to raise. It perhaps rejoins a question that Mr. McDonald had asked. The men and women whose livelihoods and whose economic capacity to support their families and their communities are the ones most affected in a very direct way if there are bad decisions, bad laws, bad policies that lead to a reduction in their capacity to sustainably prosecute their fisheries. So these people will have views on what is the appropriate way to preserve and protect fish habitat. They certainly have views, and everybody at this table has heard them around fisheries management issues. They're more than happy to offer advice on different management regimes. So their continued and formalized capacity to contribute to the long-term viability of their industry, including the protection of fish habitat, in my view, will make the economy and the ecology of the country a lot better. But that's a personal view that I've just had with conversations with a number of these intervenants, of these particular people that many of you meet regularly. But again, perfect example, Mr. Morrissey, if your committee has a view on that, and if witnesses talk about that, and you think there's an intersection point, we would benefit from that advice. But it's an ongoing conversation which goes back 40 years.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morrissey. Now, I understand you're splitting your time. Mr. Sopak, I'll let you know when your 3.5 minutes is up, and you can, I think you're going to Mr. Arnold.
I want to be really clear. I represent an agricultural constituency the size of Nova Scotia, and the agricultural community was basically traumatized by what would happen in the early 2000s and the greatly increased fisheries enforcement. To have fisheries officers show up at farmer meetings in flak jackets and sidearms was completely ridiculous. And the changes we made to the Fisheries Act came of great relief to the agricultural community. And we are bringing a number of farm groups to the table, and the committee will hear. I'm probably the longest serving member. I've been on the Fisheries Committee since 2010, since I became an MP. So I think Mr. Stringer and I are probably the longest serving, but I've been on continuously since I became an MP, so it's 6 straight years. And I can assure you there was lots of testimony in 2012, and to suggest there was no consultation or testimony when we made the changes to the Fisheries Act is not quite right. Seeing as I'm not going to get any numbers in terms of the effect that our changes had on actual fish populations, you talk a lot about how many enforcement actions there were, or budgets, or staff, or this or that. Not a word about effect on fish. Now, I am a simple man. I think this is all about fish. So, but maybe that's too simplistic. But let me give you some numbers from the changes to the Fisheries Act. And because of the changes that were made to the Fisheries Act, we were now, as a government, encouraged and enabled to create partnerships with groups, and that's how we created the Recreational Fisheries Conservation Partnerships program. And I want to thank you, Minister, for retaining the program so far, and we will be pushing to keep it retained. I'm going to go back to the sage of the Fisheries Committee staff, Mr. Kevin Stringer again, who on February 24th, 2015, gave us some metrics about what the changes to our Fisheries Act actually did. So in terms of the RFCPP, $3.1 million was spent. We, and this is Mr. Stringer talking, we had 74 different organizations, undertook 94 habitat restoration projects, and with that $3.1 million, we leveraged an additional $7 million that was brought to the same projects from partners. That's a 1 to 1.25 leverage ratio. There were 380 partners involved in those 94 projects, 1,700 volunteers. That meant 2.4 million square meters of habitat was restored, and 2,000 linear kilometers of recreational fishery habitat were restored. Those are the metrics, those are the kinds of projects that were enabled under the changes that we made to the Fisheries Act. I'm going to ask a fairly friendly question here. Minister, I would hope that you would be impressed with that program, impressed with what the recreational angling community has done. I belong to the Miramichi Salmon Association. They have been recipients of a number of grants. The Cold Water Refugia program was excellent. And I was wondering, Minister, if you could comment on the Recreational Fisheries Conservation Program and the great work that the recreational fisheries community has done.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sopak. We had the chance to talk about the Miramichi recreational fishery a few weeks ago. I know that Serge Cormier also spends a lot of time on New Brunswick and I think some Quebec rivers. You're absolutely right. There are a huge number of recreational fishing groups, frankly, on all the coasts, that have done great work in being stewards of the habitat and trying to restore and change practices that have had negative effects. So I share that view. I would add into the mix Indigenous groups. I have met Indigenous groups that also have very deeply held views on how to preserve and protect fish habitat, want to partner with the government and other non-Indigenous groups in a way that's very encouraging. And I do believe that our department and governments, federal, provincial, or municipal, are able to achieve a much higher result in terms of outcomes of better public policy or better operational outcomes if we can leverage that kind of community goodwill. So I don't disagree with the premise of your statement, and we are looking for ways to include these people in management decisions that we'll be making on an ongoing basis.
I know you're splitting your time, but Mr. Arnold, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you for being here. Mr. Minister, whether you've got the answer to this or whether you'll have to rely on staff, I'm not sure, but the previous definition prohibiting any alteration of fish habitat may have been overly restrictive, and do you believe it was overly restrictive in preventing any experimental type operations that may have actually ended up in a net increase in fish habitat or improvement to fish habitat or an increase in fish populations? Was that previous restriction previous prohibition overly restrictive?
So I'll offer a quick comment. Mr. Stringer, I know, can probably provide, or Mr. Morel, a much higher level of precision. Was it overly restrictive? I think we all have anecdotal examples, and some of them were very serious for certain individuals or communities where we may have thought that particular applications, in fact, left people with a sense that we hadn't found the right balance. I do believe, however, that, and to say that that we weren't able to authorize some experimental practices, Again, I don't have the history. Mr. Stringer, I think, has been at the Department of Fisheries since 1868, I think, is when he joined. So he could speak to the specific examples. But I do know in my own province of New Brunswick a number of circumstances where there were experimental or community activities that certainly improved fish habitat or better protected it. But perhaps, Kevin, you could offer a...
Thanks for that introduction, Minister. Someone, Deputy was pointing out, I think I may be in that picture up there, but the...
That's a Kevin Metwolf lawyer.
I would say, regardless of whether it was the old, the previous Section 35 or the current Section 35, there always are some interesting situations. I can remember 2 or 3 examples where someone wanted to put a barrier in place to ensure that that sea lamprey couldn't get up the river. Okay, and we said, no, wait a second here. We've got rules about fish passage. Okay, so you find things like that. There's been a number of recreational groups who have wanted to do something for fish habitat improvements that actually impact habitat. And so therefore we had to take a look at it. I'd say that's the case with the current, but with the previous as well. We do need to make sure that common sense prevails in either case and ensure that fisheries protection is what we're all serving going forward.
Okay, thank you. No, I'm sorry, we've run out of time, but you may get another one in because we are over brimming with time at this point. And Mr. Stringer, you're looking absolutely fabulous for your age. Thank you for joining us today. Mr. Donnelly for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on, Minister, your comments about First Nations and partnerships, I just want to make really a comment about there's an organization or table on Vancouver Island in British Columbia called the West Coast Aquatics that is going to be seeking funding for a collaborative that they have put together. So it is something that I would hope that you would talk with your colleague, the Minister of Finance, about supporting this proposal coming forward. And I know that you haven't seen the proposal, you haven't seen what it is, but I flagged that for your concern. But
you have specific information yourself, or if you want to offer me some advice, I'd be more than happy to follow up on it for you.
Happy to put that forward. Thank you. But I do want to turn to an email that I have from Shelley Hipson, and she asked, and this is to do with aquaculture, and she is, I think, from her email, quite frustrated, and she asked, how many petitions do we have to sign and present to the House of Commons asking government to remove these polluting salmon farms from our harbors and bays? And they're not listening, in my opinion, and she's even writing that there seems to be no intention of listening. I wonder if you have a comment to what you would say to Ms. Hipson.
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Donnelly. I obviously don't share Ms. Hipson's view that we're not interested in listening. I have heard from a number of people, and I know colleagues at this table have talked to me about concerns they've heard in their own constituencies, and you and I, Mr. Donnelly, had a conversation about it. I'm very sensitive to the heightened public concern around the health and safety of wild fish stocks and the interaction with principally, but perhaps not exclusively, I'm not a scientist, finfish aquaculture in open pens and open waters. I had I thought, a rather robust conversation with our colleagues in the Senate yesterday about exactly that, saying that I think one of the obligations the government can move forward with very quickly is making all of the scientific data, all of the scientific information available as transparently and as easily, understandably as possible. Understandably, I'm sure that's the right English, but in a way that people can understand. We will be, as I said earlier to one of your colleagues, endeavoring to do that on an ongoing basis. We've made significant investments in science, $197 million, largely recoups the cuts in the previous government in science. It's never enough. It's, in my view, a good beginning. It's a good down payment. I'm hoping and believe that we can do more, because that's the way that we can reassure Canadians that we have the right balance, and that's also the way that we can make the best decisions around these management issues. As I said, Mr. Donnelly, I'm a National Aquaculture Act. A number of people have called for that for a long time. I'm not sure it sees unanimity easily, but I think we should, back to Ms. Hipson, we should be listening and open to understanding if that would be also a way to ensure that the very best regulatory, legislative, and scientific measures are in place, enforceable measures are in place, and then listen to people like Ms. Hipson and other scientists who have strongly held views.
Excellent, thank you. And you mentioned earlier that 1,100 staff were cut, those working on habitat protection in the department, and you also mentioned you're trying to fix that problem. Wouldn't you agree that there should be a moratorium on major energy projects or major projects that are impacting fisheries until that time?
May not surprise you. I'm not sure I agree with your. I think it's a trick question, Mr. Chair. We're confusing a oil tanker moratorium with a moratorium on major projects. But no, so the deputy tells me that about 170 of those staff reductions were in the habitat protection area. We had, as I say, from 63 to 16 offices closed. So that speaks to public confidence too, Mr. Donnelly, in the sense that in Mr. McDonald's riding in Avalon, they can't find somebody at an office that can answer their questions. It creates, I think, an unnecessary concern. Of the 135 new scientists we committed to hiring with the money that the budget of 2016 gave us, of April 1st of this year, we've already hired over 100 of those, many of them working in world-class facilities in your province, like the West Vancouver lab that I had the privilege of visiting this summer. We're hoping to do a lot more, but the government will take its responsibility to look at some of these major energy projects. I can imagine perhaps you're referring to one in particular, or a couple that may have come by this past summer. We will look at those.
Certainly in our province we have Kinder Morgan, we have the Northern Gateway. So our province is seeing that, and those pipelines cross a huge number of water courses, fisheries, habitat, and so it's really important. But if I, in the remaining short time that I have, could turn to oceans for a quick second. Unlike the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the U.S. or the European Union fisheries policy, Canada's Fisheries Act doesn't include any requirement to stop overfishing or create rebuilding plans in the Act. And I know the department has policies that require rebuilding plans, but implementation has been very slow. For instance, it's been 25 years since Northern Cod. Do you believe that rebuilding plans should be legally mandated in this Act?
And Mr. Donnelly, others have raised that with me. It's an interesting legislative construct. I'm told that some jurisdictions that have it have treated it fairly pro forma. So you throw up on the website once a year, you cut and paste last year's plan and just change the date and put it out as a rebuilding plan. I think that feeds public cynicism and doesn't help the common objective of better managing our fisheries and aquatic resources. We have internally at the department, as you noted, a number of policy measures, and in certain cases like the Species at Risk Act and so on, have different provisions. You're correct, you were referring to the Fisheries Act, you're absolutely right. Again, if this committee feels strongly or has views or on how that could be looked at as part of a modern regime, I'm not sure it touches lost protections around habitat, but it's very much part of the conversation, because past failures to either protect habitat or, to use your example of overfishing, and there are for generations examples on every coast where perhaps in good faith decisions were made that have led to very difficult consequences. The people that suffer those consequences in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador for a long time around Northern Cod will want to know that their governments and maybe their parliament are seized of this issue, So if you have suggestions of how we could do that in a legislative context, I would be open to looking at them, but I certainly share the root of your concern and would want to work with everybody to find the best way to do that.
Minister, and
I think you might have time to do that.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Because we still have approximately, well, a little over 10 minutes. We have about 13 minutes left. In the spirit of equality, we always go to 3 questions. They're going to have to be limited, however, if you choose to ask the question. We have about 3 to 5 minutes. Please keep it around 3 if you have a couple questions. Ms. Jordan, would you like to begin?
I just have one question, and I want to thank the minister again for coming in. And a couple of things he says: 1,100 positions cut, going from 63 to 16 offices. It really comes back to what we've heard here, that it's becoming quite hard to be a DFO employee over the past number of years. We actually heard that in testimony on Monday. And the suggestion was made that this committee should consider, as part of the study, that given the outstanding talent within the department, that perhaps they just need a little bit of space to do their job. Can you give us some insight on how, through your mandate, you intend to bring a different style of leadership to DFO?
Thank you, Ms. Jordan and Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Jordan, for the question. I share your view. I have had, as a member of Parliament from New Brunswick, a chance to work directly with some of the local and regional officials of our department in various branches of Fisheries and Oceans, which is a highly decentralized department. We now have the Canadian Coast Guard as partners in our department, a remarkable group of women and men as well. And to the person, the people that I've had the privilege of working with as a member of Parliament, or certainly in the few months I've been the minister, they are an outstanding group of Canadians. They care deeply about the environment. They care deeply about the protection of our oceans. They're inspired by the hard work of women and men who earn their living on the seas or in lakes. And many of them volunteer with community groups and go to meetings in the evenings, and because they want to be actively involved in their communities, and because they live in many of these communities that are directly affected by the decisions that they participate in taking. So I share your view that perhaps they have not felt as supported, as valued, as they should have been and as they are by Canadians. Some of it has been the financial constraints that the department has lived under. We're trying to remedy that. There's often never enough money to do all of the good things we want to do. But the deputy and I and the commissioner of the Coast Guard and the senior management of the department have been working with the Treasury Board and ultimately the Department of Finance. I'm told that I'll have a chance to meet with some of the Treasury Board people in the coming months and hopefully resolve what has been, we've been calling it sort of an integrity gap, in the sense we have more and more programs that Canadians expect the department to deliver, and in some cases we don't have the adequate resources to properly deliver those programs. So ships are breaking down in the Coast Guard because we're not doing the maintenance, because we have to use that money for operational purposes. That's not the way to run a multi-billion-dollar institution, and that's not the way to best serve Canadians who care deeply about the work that the department should and can be doing. So we hope to get to a better place, but the mistakes, Ms. Jordan, will be mine, and the hard work and the insight that comes from the department will be the remarkable group of almost 10,500 women and men who work in the department.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jordan. We now go to Mr. Doherty for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, the International Chamber of Shipping, which represents over 80% of the world merchant fleet, have serious concerns about the Liberals' plan to establish a moratorium on the shipment of crude oil in the waters in northern BC. Can you explain the impacts of your proposed moratorium will have on jobs and economy? As your testimony today, in the next few days, you're likely going to make an announcement on this. Can you explain what that impact is going to have on jobs and economy in the province of British Columbia, but also in Canada?
Sure, I can try. I think you'll agree with me, Mr. Doherty. We may not agree on the modalities of the moratorium or how and why there should be one, but I hope you'll agree that we were transparent in the election campaign with Canadians, that was a formal commitment that we had made in the platform, and it's a mandate letter instruction. We've taken the unprecedented step of making these mandate letters public, so Canadians can see that it's a It's an instruction that both Mark Garneau and I have received. Mark Garneau, the Minister of Transport, has obviously the lead on this. I've been working with him because we believe that there is understandable and reasonable concern on the northwest coast of British Columbia around oil tanker traffic. We believe that British Columbians care deeply, and I saw it in Bella Bella on Sunday. They care deeply about the protection of the coast, as you call it, as they call it. Your magnificent province is defined by a deep attachment to the coast and iconic species like salmon. So we're trying to find the right balance between economic development that's sustainable and responsible, but also reacting to scientific and public concern around the cumulative effects of some of these shipping routes. But to be honest, Mr. Doherty, I would suggest that those questions, Mr. Garneau really he's visited the coast of BC, he's met people like the organization you referred to, and he's in a better position than I am to address the specifics. I'm trying to give you a sense of the political commitment we made to Canadians.
Mr. LeBlanc, is it your testimony today that the federal government is going to announce in the coming days a moratorium on the tanker traffic on the West Coast?
No, it's not. That was an extrapolation you made of what I said, that we will be having some news on this and other issues in the coming weeks, I think, if I said days. But it's no secret. This isn't a secret. This was if we didn't intend as a party to keep our election campaign commitments, we wouldn't have left the party platform on the Liberal website. So there should be no confusion as to what that commitment was, how it's put into effect, and what are the modalities of it. As I say, it's really Mr. Garneau who's been leading that, and I'm sure he would be interested in answering questions from colleagues in the House of Commons, or if you want, I'd be happy to, once we're advanced to a position where we have something to say publicly about this, I'd be happy to make sure that you or any of your colleagues that are interested have a chance to offer advice and understand exactly what this means. But it's hardly a secret that we intend to impose that moratorium. Excuse me.
Thank you, Minister. It's okay. Mr. Donnelly, we have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you, Minister, for spending the time here with us and answering our questions. I have a number of comments that I want to add and finish with a question. And we referenced the Coast Guard, and I just want to thank the government for reopening the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station. I think that was people on the West Coast absolutely were welcoming that move, and happy to see that. On Vancouver Island, though, not so happy about the closure of the Comox MCTS station. And of course, we've just recently had the sinking of the Nathan E. Stewart. And we have Chief Marilyn Slett of the Heiltsuk Nation, I believe is in Ottawa this week and today to talk about how that's impacting their aquaculture and their food and their way of life. But in the remaining time, I just want to mention about my bill. I have a bill, as you mentioned earlier, on moving to closed containment on the West Coast. There was a mention last night from our Parliament Secretary of no evidence of impact from aquaculture. I hope that isn't the view of the minister, of yourself, of the ministry, because I think there has been ample evidence shown that is clear that there is an impact. In fact, Justice Cohen recognizes that. And there was also a comment about unproven technology, and we have Katerra leading the way on the West Coast and Sustainable Blue both on the East Coast, both proven technologies using it, Katerra being probably a year away from profit. So my question is, do you share those comments about there being no evidence and that this is unproven technology?
Well, so let me, you can't offer a politician a nice compliment like you did, Mr. Donnelly, without allowing me a chance to thank you for it. I do share your view, and it was special for us at Kitsilano that you could participate in that announcement. I have learned from my colleagues from your province the deep attachment that people have to that Coast Guard base. we made a commitment to reopen a different but similar circumstance in the province of our chair, of your committee chair, and we're hoping to have some news on that also in the coming days and weeks. With respect to the aquaculture question you asked, and maybe I'll ask Serge, I didn't see his speech last night. I was at another meeting. I know that there is evidence around the economic viability and questions. Evidence is a legal term. There are concerns and questions around the economic viability of moving to closed containment in some cases. I've heard that from a number of people, but as I say, I think the debate around your bill will enlighten that. Will offer some insight. Our department has contributed some money for various pilot projects to better understand how that might work, and I know there are other jurisdictions where it has been successful. I think what I've said publicly is that we understand the heightened level of public concern around how can this be done safely, or what are the risks. I won't answer it with a leading question. What are the risks to fish and fish health, wild fish and fish health, of some of these practices? The public wants to know answers to those questions. Our department has a key role in helping them understand that through more science, more transparent, accessible scientific evidence, and people who do not follow the conditions of their permits, or who are not able to follow the appropriate measures that are in place to ensure that there's no risk to fish health, need to suffer in a severe way the consequences of not respecting those conditions or those undertakings. And I've already spoken to the department about ensuring that we're very robust in that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. And to end...
Point of order?
Point of order, yes. Go ahead, Mr. Sobel.
We went to great lengths to create our witness list, and it was a good witness list. However, last week we had a witness who was not on the witness list, and I have no idea where Mr. Martin Ozinski came from, because he was not on our original witness list. So my point of order is, if now this witness list is going to change, my request would be, and one of the witnesses that we asked for was the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They did not show up on this list, the witness that we asked for, and I met with them today, and they are very keen on presenting to our committee, yet a witness who was not on this list showed up last week, and that's essentially unfair. So I request that Cap be allowed to present.
It's not a point of order. However, I will comment to it, because I think you may have a legitimate point. I mean, this, as you know, in the beginning was not written in stone as to the witness list. It is evolving. I'm certainly open to have a discussion to include someone if you wish. And to end, thank you, Mr. Sobel. To end, I would like to say something that hasn't been said in this House in about 40 years, and that is the Fisheries Committee would like to thank its Minister, Monsieur Leblanc, for appearing here today. For those of you too young to remember, Mr. Leblanc's father, Romeo Leblanc, was a Minister of Fisheries and Oceans from 1972 to...
No, he was elected in 72, 74 to 82. He's the longest-serving the first Minister of Fisheries and Oceans when the department was formed, but the longest-serving fisheries minister since Confederation.
Very good.
Thank you
very much. Thank you, everybody.